Voron had watched species enter the assembly hall for 600 years. He had seen the Olvari bow so low their antennas scraped the floor. He had seen the Droon, back when there were Droon, shuffle in with their eyes down and their translated speech full of apologies for existing. Every young species walked into the conclave of voices the same way. Nervous, grateful, small. The humans walked in like they owned the building, and were just being polite about it. There were 7 of them. Voron counted twice, because the number made no sense. The Thuri sent 42 delegates. The Rithon sent 38. Even the Ilvari, who barely had a functioning government half the time, sent 20. 7 delegates to represent an entire species was either an insult or a confession of how little they had to offer. Voron decided it was neither. It was ignorance. Young species did not understand ceremony. The one in front was a woman named Kirith Selen. Voron had read her file. Ambassador, 46 years old, which was nothing. Her species barely lived past 100. She was small in the way all humans were small. No claws, no venom glands, no bioelectric field, no secondary skeletal structure. Soft skin over soft muscle over breakable bones. She smiled at everyone she passed, and the smile reached her eyes, and Voron found this more unsettling than he expected. Behind her walked a man with a jaw like the edge of a ship hull. Commander Marin Soy, military attaché. His file was thinner than it should have been, which meant most of it was classified. He did not smile. He walked with the steady precision of someone who had been trained to enter rooms where things could go wrong. The other 5 were unknown to Voron. They carried no weapons, no technology, nothing except thin briefcases and the quiet confidence of people who had prepared for something. The ceremony began. The speaker of the conclave, a Rithon minister named Hadrin Voss, welcomed humanity in the traditional manner. He spoke of the great honor. He spoke of the long history of the conclave. He spoke of the mentorship that older species would provide. He used the word guidance 11 times. Voron counted, because counting was what he did during ceremonies to keep from falling asleep. Then the Charter of Guided Integration was presented. It was 140 pages. Voron knew what was in it, because he had helped write it, 40 years ago, when humans first made contact and applied for probationary membership. It was a cage built out of legal language and decorated with words like protection and developmental framework and structured growth. Trade lanes. Humanity would be assigned routes through the least profitable sectors, lanes that older species had abandoned decades ago because there was nothing worth hauling through them. Military tonnage. Their fleet was capped at a level that could defend exactly 1 system, maybe 2 if they were creative. Colony expansion. 3 systems, pre-approved, all of them resource-poor rocks that no one else wanted. Every young species got the same charter. Every young species accepted it. The ones that didn't, Voron pushed the thought away. The ones that didn't were not around to complain. Kirith Solen stood at the podium and read the charter. All 140 pages. She did not skim, she did not skip. She read every clause, every subclause, every footnote. The hall grew restless. Someone from the Mekali Directorate yawned loudly enough to echo. Kirith kept reading. When she finished, she looked up. That smile again, warm and full and aimed at everyone. "We accept," she said. She signed. Voron felt something in his chest unclench. He had not realized it was clenched. He told himself this was normal. Young species sometimes made noise during their induction, threatened to walk out, demanded revisions. The fact that the humans accepted without protest was efficient, clean, good. Commander Tsoi stood behind Kirith while she signed. Voron noticed his hands. They were at his sides, fingers straight, pressed against his thighs so hard the knuckles had gone white. The tendons in his neck stood out like cables on a suspension bridge. His face showed nothing. His body screamed. Kirith handed the signed charter back to Hadrin Voss and thanked him. She thanked the conclave. She thanked the Thuri, specifically, for their mentorship during the probationary period, and Voron felt a warmth that he later wished he had examined more carefully. The human delegation returned to their seats. The ceremony concluded. Delegates filed out. Voron passed by the human section and stopped. Kirith was still seated. She had a briefcase on her lap. Not the thin ones the others carried. This one was older, heavier, scratched along the corners, in a way that suggested it had traveled a long distance, many times. Her hands rested on top of it. She was not opening it. "Ambassador Selene," Voron said, "I congratulate you on humanity's acceptance into the conclave." She looked up. "Thank you, Delegate Voron. Your species has been very kind to us." "May I ask, what is in your briefcase?" The smile changed. It did not disappear. It just rearranged itself into something that Voron, 600 years old and fluent in the body language of 30 species, could not read. "A counter-proposal," she said, "in case today went differently." But it did not go differently. "No," she said, "it did not." She stood, tucked the briefcase under her arm, and walked out. Soy followed her. The other 5 followed Soy. 7 humans, single file, out of the hall, into the corridor, gone. Voron turned to his adjutant, a younger Thuri named Palith, who had been recording the session. "They learn fast," Voron said. "Give them a century. They will be fine." Palith nodded and made a note. Later, much later, Voron would remember this moment. He would remember the briefcase. He would remember the smile he could not read. He would remember the 7 delegates who walked in like they owned the building, and walked out like they had already measured it for renovations. He would remember saying, "Give them a century," and he would want to reach back through time and grab himself by the collar and shake. But that was later. On that day, the humans signed the charter, said thank you, and went back to their quarters. A staff member in the records office noted that humanity's first official request as full conclave members, filed within an hour of the ceremony, was a renewal of their access to the historical archives. The request was granted without review. No one thought to ask what they were looking for. Sene Mal had been the conclave's senior archivist for 90 years, and in that time she had learned one absolute truth about the galaxy's species. Nobody read the archives. Oh, they accessed them. Delegates would pull a specific ruling when they needed ammunition for a trade dispute. Legal teams would search for precedents. Occasionally, a historian from one of the founding species would browse the cultural records for a book no one would finish. But nobody read them. Not the way you read something when you were trying to understand the shape of the thing that held you. The humans read them. Sene first noticed the pattern 14 years into humanity's probationary period. Access logs showed that human researchers, different ones, rotating in teams, were pulling files at a rate that dwarfed any species in conclave history. Not military files, not technology patents. They were reading committee minutes. Trade arbitration rulings from 9,000 years ago. Sealed procedural amendments. Integration charter drafts. Not just their own, but every species that had ever been inducted. She flagged it to her superior, a Rithan bureaucrat named Hesk, who had held the position for so long he had become a kind of furniture. "Curious species," Hesk said. "It is what young civilizations do. They explore." "They are not exploring," Sene said. "They are mapping." Hesk waved a manipulator arm and returned to his lunch. Sene did not return to her lunch. She began tracking the human access patterns herself, quietly, in a personal file she kept separate from the official systems. Over 26 years, she built a picture, and the picture made her stomach do things her stomach was not designed to do. The humans had cross-referencing 11,000 years of conclave rulings. They had built a database. She could see the shape of it from the access patterns that connected trade decisions to military authorizations, to colonial approvals, to charter amendments. They had mapped the relationships between every founding species and every inducted species. They had tracked which species received lighter restrictions and which received heavier ones, and they had correlated these differences with a single variable: patronage. Species with a founding member patron, a Thuri ally, a Rithan trade partner, a Michaeli client state, received charters that allowed growth. Their trade lanes improved within decades. Their military caps lifted. Their colony restrictions eased. They rose. Species without patrons received the standard charter, the real charter, the one that capped their growth at a level that made independence impossible without centuries of slow accumulation. They became dependent. They stayed small. They provided labor and resources and votes in the assembly, and in return, they received the privilege of being inside the system rather than outside it. Two species, the Droon and the Voskat, had tried to grow beyond their charter restrictions without patron support. Sen pulled their files. She had never read them before. Nobody had in a very long time. The Droon had their trade access revoked after a dispute with the Rithan over mineral rights in a system the Droon had colonized legally. Without trade, their colonies starved. Within 3 generations, they requested voluntary integration into the Rithan economic zone. Their seat in the assembly was dissolved. Their culture, their language, their name, absorbed, dissolved, gone. The Voskats simply vanished from the records. 1 century they were a member species with 12 colony worlds. The next century, their worlds were listed as unclaimed and redistributed. No conflict noted. Just a quiet erasure, like someone had deleted a line from a spreadsheet and never thought about it again. Sene sat in the archive, alone, surrounded by 11,000 years of records, and felt the specific cold of discovering that the house you live in was built on bones. 3 months after humanity's formal induction, she watched them from a distance. They were model members. They paid their tariffs without complaint. They attended every subcommittee meeting. They filed paperwork on time and in the correct format. Kirith Selen appeared at a routine trade subcommittee session. She sat through 2 hours of discussion about shipping lane allocations. When the floor opened for questions, she raised her hand. "Minister Hadron," she said to the Rython chair, "I noticed that Rython-flagged cargo vessels carrying processed minerals through Sector 7G are exempt from the standard transit tariff under Provision 4.12 of the Rython Integration Charter. Is that correct?" Hadron checked his files. "That is correct. The exemption was established during the Rython integration. And the equivalent human-flagged vessels carrying the same processed minerals through the same sector are subject to the full tariff under our charter?" "The charters are species-specific, Ambassador." "Of course. Thank you, Minister. I just wanted to confirm that for the record." She sat down. Hadron moved on. Nobody in the room noticed what had just happened. Sen noticed. She had been watching. She saw Kirith attend 6 more committee meetings over the next 3 months. At each one, she asked a single precise question. Each question forced a committee chair to confirm on the official record a specific inconsistency between how the charter was applied to founding species and how it was applied to everyone else. Each answer was now part of the permanent record, searchable, citable, admissible. Sene pulled the access logs again. The human research teams had shifted their focus. They were no longer mapping the archive. They were organizing it, sorting it, building something. In a different part of the galaxy, in the 3 resource-poor systems humanity had been assigned, Commander Marin Soy was running fleet exercises. The exercises complied with every tonnage restriction in the charter. The ships were small. The weapons were within legal limits. The formations were standard. Sen would not learn this until much later, but the humans were not practicing how to fight the way the Conclave fought. They were practicing something else, something that did not appear in any tactical manual in the archive, because no one had ever thought of it. This was the thing about humans that Sen was beginning to understand. They did not invent new weapons. They invented new uses for the ones they already had. She sat in the archive on a quiet night shift, the glow of 11,000 years of records casting blue light across her face, and looked at the pattern the humans had built. Not the data itself. She had seen the data. She looked at the shape, the architecture, what it was for. They had not been studying the conclave to learn how to be good members. They had not been studying it to find advantages or loopholes or shortcuts. They had been building a case. A prosecution, backed by the conclave's own evidence, assembled from the conclave's own records, using the conclave's own rules of procedure. 40 years. They had spent 40 years reading and cross-referencing and waiting and asking no questions until they knew every answer in advance. Seni closed the file. She turned off her console. She sat in the dark for a long time. The humans were coming. Not with ships, not with weapons, with receipts. The notification arrived on Voron's desk at dawn. An extraordinary session of the full conclave, formally requested by the human delegation, under Article 7, Section 31 of the Founding Protocols. Voron read it twice. Then he called Paleth. When was the last time someone invoked an extraordinary session? Paleth checked the records. 2,114 years ago. The Macaulay Directorate requested one during the Spiral Arm trade collapse. And before that? Never. Voron put down the notification. He picked it up again. He put it down. He told himself this was a procedural curiosity. Young species sometimes stumbled across old rules and used them for attention. It meant nothing. The assembly convened 3 days later. All 38 member species, every seat filled. The hall on Keth Vasur had not been this full since Voron's first century. Delegates who normally sent junior staff showed up in person. The Ilvari sent their prime speaker. The Macaulay Directorate sent all 3 of their rotating chancellors. Everyone wanted to see what the humans were doing. The 7 delegates entered the hall. Same formation as the induction ceremony. Kirith in front, Soy behind her, the other 5 in a line. They wore the same dark formal suits. They carried the same thin briefcases. But something was different. Voron felt it before he could name it. They were not smiling. Kirith walked to the speaking platform at the center of the hall. She placed her briefcase on the podium. She opened it. She removed a document, physical paper, which was unusual. Most species use digital displays. The paper was thick. There was a lot of it. She looked up at the assembly. 312 delegates from 38 species, seated in a rising arc around her, waiting. Distinguished delegates, she said. Her voice was even, controlled. The translation systems carried it to every seat. Humanity has filed a petition of grievances under Article 7, Section 31 of the Founding Protocols. We exercise our right to present this petition in full session with uninterrupted speaking privilege, as established by precedent. Hadron Voss, the Rythan speaker of the conclave, leaned forward. What precedent, Ambassador? Case 4471R, filed 6,400 years ago by the Thuri Concord, in which the Thuri established that any species invoking an extraordinary session is granted uninterrupted speaking rights for the full duration of the presentation. She paused. The Thuri won that ruling unanimously. Voron felt the floor shift under him. Not physically, structurally. She had just used his own species precedent as a shield, and she had done it in the first 30 seconds. Kirith began reading. The petition of grievances was 4,000 pages long. It was not a plea. It was an autopsy of the conclave itself, conducted with surgical patience and illustrated with the conclave's own records. She started with the Charter of Guided Integration. She read its stated purpose, to protect young species during their period of institutional development. Then, She presented the data. 340 individual instances of asymmetric charter enforcement. Each one documented, each one cited, each one drawn from the official archives. She named species. She named delegates. She read dates and rulings and sealed committee minutes that had been buried so long they had grown digital dust. She presented economic models, built by her team, verified against conclave data, showing that the Standard Charter, applied without patron intervention, mathematically guaranteed economic stagnation. Not might cause it. Guaranteed it. The way gravity guarantees that dropped objects fall. The hall was quiet. Not the polite quiet of attention. The held breath quiet of 38 species realizing they were being cross-examined by their own history. She named the Droon. The Droon were a member species for 412 years, Kirath said. They colonized 14 worlds. They developed a unique musical tradition that integrated bioharmonic frequencies. They had a word, Droonathal, that meant the feeling of hearing your child's voice for the first time. There is no equivalent in any other language. When their trade access was revoked, following a dispute they did not start, their colonies could not sustain themselves. Within 3 generations, the Droon requested voluntary integration into the Rithan economic zone. Their seat was dissolved. Their worlds were absorbed. Their language is preserved in our archive. Nothing else remains. Silence. She named the Vosket. The Vosket were a member species for 209 years. They had 12 colony worlds. In the year 4822 by Conclave's standard calendar, they appear in the records. In the year 4831, their worlds are listed as unclaimed. There is no war recorded, no conflict, no tribunal, no vote, no explanation. She set down the page she was holding. They had a word, too. We do not know what it was. No one kept it. She said the word extinction 7 times during the petition. Each time the hall flinched. Not visibly. Voron could feel it in the air recyclers. 38 species holding their breath at the same moment created a measurable drop in carbon dioxide output. After 4 hours, Voron attempted to intervene. He stood and cited procedural grounds for a recess. Kirath looked at him. Delegate Voron, Case 4471R, grants uninterrupted speaking rights. Your species argued that interruption during an extraordinary session constitutes a violation of the petitioner's sovereign voice. The ruling was unanimous. Would you like me to read it into the record? Voron sat down. The petition continued. 11 hours. The 7 humans rotated speakers. Each one was a specialist. Trade law, military doctrine, colonial policy, economic modeling, xenosociology, archival evidence, and Kirath, who tied them together. They had not brought 7 delegates because they were small. They had brought 7 because 7 was the exact number needed to present every dimension of the case without a single gap. At the end, Kirath returned to the podium. She gathered her papers. She placed them back in the briefcase. This petition does not ask for renegotiation, she said. It does not ask for special treatment. It asks this body a question it has never been asked. She looked at the assembly, every face, every species. By what right? The hall breathed. We request a formal response within 1 standard cycle, she said. We will be in our quarters. She closed the briefcase. Reading, she said. The human delegation walked out. Not fast, not slow. 7 people, single file, through the center of the hall, past 312 silent delegates, and out the doors. Voron did not watch them leave. He was watching something else. The Ilvari delegate, a woman named Sarith Cole, was staring at the doors the humans had walked through. Her expression was not horror. It was not confusion. She looked like someone who had just been handed the word for something she had felt her entire life. Voron looked around the hall. The younger species, the Ilvari, the Ten, the Kashuri, the Osk, They were all wearing the same expression. Not angry, not frightened. Awake. Palith was already looking at him. Neither of them said anything. The hall emptied slowly. Delegates gathered in clusters, speaking in low voices, not meeting each other's eyes. Voron remained in his seat. He looked at the empty podium where Kirith had stood. He looked at the space where the Droon delegation had once sat, 3 centuries before he was born. He had never noticed the empty seat before. He noticed it now. Voron wrote the response at his desk in the early hours, when the station's artificial daylight had not yet begun. His office overlooked the assembly hall through a long window. The hall was dark. He kept glancing at it while he wrote, the way a person keeps touching a bruise to check if it still hurts. The Thuri, the Rithan, and the Macaulay Directorate had held an emergency meeting within hours of the petition. The meeting was short. The conclusion was unanimous. The petition had to be rejected. Not because it was wrong. Voron understood this with a clarity that sat in his chest like a cold stone. The petition was not wrong. Every citation was accurate. Every economic model was sound. Every historical case was documented in the Conclave's own records, filed by the Conclave's own archivists, under rules the Conclave itself had written. The petition had to be rejected because of what it would mean if it was accepted. If the founding species admitted that the Charter of Guided Integration was a tool of control, then every charter ever issued was illegitimate. Every trade restriction, every military cap, every colonial boundary, 42 species, 11,000 years of structure, all of it resting on a foundation that a species barely a century old had just proven was rotten. Concede to the humans, and the Conclave dissolves. Not today, not tomorrow, but the idea would spread. Other species would file their own petitions. They would demand audits. They would ask the same question. By what right? And the founding species would have no answer, because the answer, the real answer, the one Voron had known his entire career and never spoken aloud, was, by the right of having gotten here first. That was it. That was the entire architecture. Priority, seniority, the accident of being older. Voron wrote the response. He used the word stability 14 times. By the 9th, it had stopped sounding like a principle. By the 14th, it sounded like a prayer. The response was delivered in open session the next day. Hadrian Voss read it. His tone was warm, paternal, the kind of voice used on children who have done something clever but inappropriate. The Conclave appreciates humanity's thorough engagement with institutional history, Hadrian read. This spirit of inquiry reflects the intellectual energy that makes humanity a valued member of our community. However, the Conclave must note that as the most recently inducted species, humanity's standing to challenge foundational charters is limited by precedent and by the principles of institutional continuity that have preserved peace for 11 millennia. He paused. He turned a page. Furthermore, the Conclave expresses concern that the filing of a petition of grievances, while procedurally valid, represents a destabilizing action inconsistent with the spirit of the Charter of Guided Integration. Accordingly, the Conclave invokes Provision 9.4 of the Security Protocols, authorizing stabilization measures for any member species engaging in actions deemed disruptive to institutional cohesion. Voron watched the human delegation as the words landed. Stabilization measures. The phrase was clean and bureaucratic, and it meant trade access frozen, military monitors stationed in human systems, colonial development suspended, pending review. It meant the cage they had signed into was about to get smaller. 6 of the 7 human delegates went still. Professional stillness. Trained stillness. The kind that comes from knowing exactly how bad things are and choosing not to react until the right moment. Kirith Selen did something different. She smiled. Not the warm, diplomatic smile from the induction ceremony. Not the unreadable one she had given Voron in the hall. This was a small, private thing, like someone turning a key in a lock they had built themselves. Senimal sat in the public gallery above the hall. She had come to watch because she could not stay away. She saw the smile. She understood it before anyone else in the room did. Kirith had expected this answer. She had needed this answer. Hadron finished reading. The hall waited. 312 delegates stared at 7 humans. Kirith stood. The human delegation thanks the conclave for its response, she said. Her voice was the same as always, even, measured, polite. We formally withdraw the petition of grievances. A rustle of relief moved through the hall. Voron exhaled. Haleth made a note. Delegates shifted in their seats. We also withdraw ourselves. The rustle stopped. Kirith continued as if she had said something ordinary. Under Article 12, Section 3 of the Membership Protocols, any species may withdraw from the conclave voluntarily, with immediate effect. All treaties, trade agreements, military accords, and territorial recognitions executed under the terms of membership are dissolved upon withdrawal. Humanity hereby exercises this right. She closed her briefcase. The old one, the scratched one, still closed, still unopened. Effective immediately. The 7 humans stood. The same motion, the same moment, as if they had rehearsed it. And Voron realized they had. They had rehearsed this. They had planned for this. The petition, the response, the rejection, the withdrawal. It was a sequence, and they had known the steps before the music started. Kirith walked toward the exit. Soy behind her. The 5 specialists behind him. Single file. The same formation they always used. 7 people walking through the center of the largest deliberative body in the galaxy. Past delegates from species that had been old when humanity was still learning to make fire. Hadron stood. Ambassador Selene, I must insist. There are procedural requirements for withdrawal, a transition period. Article 12, Section 3, Subsection F, Kirith said without turning around. Voluntary withdrawal is effective immediately and requires no transition period. This clause was added by the Thuri Concord 4,000 years ago to ensure that membership remained voluntary in principle as well as practice. She kept walking. Voron could not breathe, not because of the withdrawal. Withdrawal was a word, paper, politics. What stopped his breathing was what he saw when he looked away from the humans and into the faces of the delegates around him. The Ilvari delegate, Sarath Cole, was watching the humans leave. Her hands were in her lap. Her face was calm. She was not surprised. She had known this was coming. The 10 delegation, 3 amphibious creatures with iridescent skin, sat motionless. One of them was writing something on a tablet, small, quick strokes, and when Voron looked closer, the 10 covered the tablet with a wet hand. The Kashuri delegate had his eyes closed. He was breathing in the slow, deliberate pattern his species used during strategic calculation. They were not panicking. They were taking notes. Voron looked at Paleth. Paleth's recording device was shaking in his hand. Not because he was afraid of the humans leaving, because he understood what happened next. The humans' charter, the one Kirith had signed 3 months ago, the cage of trade restrictions and military caps and colonial limits, was a contract. A contract required 2 parties. When one party withdrew, the contract was void. Every restriction, every cap, every limit, every cage door, open. Humanity outside the conclave was humanity with no leash. No trade lanes. They could trade with anyone, anywhere. No military cap. They could build whatever they wanted. No colonial restrictions. They could expand into any unclaimed system. The Charter had not been protecting the galaxy from humanity. It had been protecting humanity from the galaxy, and the founding species had just torn it up. The doors of the assembly hall closed behind the human delegation. The sound was not loud. It did not echo. It was a soft mechanical sound, the kind of sound that doors make every day, everywhere, meaning nothing. It was the loudest thing Voron had ever heard. The hall erupted, delegates shouting, ministers standing. The Rethon demanded an emergency session. The Macaulay called for military readiness. Hadron Voss banged a ceremonial staff against the podium and called for order. Voron did not move. He sat in his seat and stared at the closed doors. Behind him the gallery hummed with noise and motion and fear. Senny Mal sat in the gallery above it all, watching the chaos below. She did not join it. She was thinking about the briefcase. The old one, the scratched one, the one Kirith had carried since the first day. She had never opened it. Whatever was inside, the counter-proposal, the moderate path, the version of this story where the conclave reformed itself and survived. Kirith had brought it to every session. She had set it on every podium. She had held it in her lap during every committee meeting. And she had never opened it. Because opening it required the conclave to meet her halfway. And the conclave, with all its wisdom, all its history, all its 11,000 years of precedent and protocol, had chosen to push back instead. They chose the mirror. She just held it up. The doors stayed closed. The humans did not come back. 6 months later, the assembly hall on Keth Vassur was half empty. Voron went there every morning. Not for sessions. Sessions had become irregular, poorly attended, sometimes cancelled. He went because he did not know what else to do. 600 years of walking through those doors had worn grooves in his mind, pathways so deep that his body moved through them, even when his purpose had evaporated. He sat in his seat. Around him, the absences were louder than any speech. The Olvari seat was empty. They had been the first to leave, 3 weeks after the humans. Sareth Cole had stood in this very hall and delivered a withdrawal notice that was 4 sentences long. She did not file a petition. She did not present evidence. She did not need to. The humans had already done the work. All she had to do was say the word. The 10 followed. Then the Kashuri. Then the Osk. Then 3 more species Voron had thought were loyal. Not to the Conclave's ideals, he now understood, but to its power. When the power cracked, loyalty went with it. 11 species had suspended active participation. 3 had formally withdrawn. The Macaulay Directorate had not left the Conclave, but it was barely holding itself together. Their own colonial territories, governed by charters modeled on the same architecture the humans had exposed, were demanding renegotiation. 2 Macaulay colonies had declared economic independence. A third was an open political revolt. The Directorate's 3 rotating chancellors spent their days arguing with each other in closed sessions, and emerged looking older each time. The Rithon maintained their seat, and their composure, and their tone of calm authority. But their trade revenues had dropped by 30%. 9 species, 9, had signed bilateral trade agreements with humanity outside the Conclave framework. Human cargo ships moved through lanes that had no restrictions, carrying goods at prices the Conclave's tariff structure could not match. Voron watched a human cargo vessel pass the viewport of his office one morning. It was small, unarmed. It flew a route that 6 months ago would have violated 4 different Conclave regulations. Now it flew free. He was afraid of it, not of its weapons, because it had none, not of its size, because it was tiny. He was afraid of what it meant. A single ship, flying wherever it wanted, trading with whoever it chose, operating under no charter and no guidance and no structure, and functioning perfectly well, better, perhaps, than the ships that still obeyed the rules. The ship was proof. Proof that the Conclave was not necessary. Proof that the structure Voron had spent 6 centuries maintaining was not the skeleton that held civilization upright. It was the cage that kept it from standing on its own. On a quiet afternoon, a communication arrived from Earth. It was addressed to the full conclave, but Voron read it alone in the half-empty hall because there were not enough delegates present to constitute a quorum. The message was from Kirith Selen. It was not a demand. It was not a threat. It was not a list of conditions or a declaration of superiority. It was an invitation. Humanity was hosting an open diplomatic summit. All species welcome. Former conclave members, non-members, anyone. No preconditions, no charters, no guidance frameworks. The agenda was one line. What should we build instead? Voron read the line 3 times. He put the message down. He picked it up. He put it down again. 40 years. The humans had spent 40 years reading the Conclave's archives, learning the system, mapping its failures. 3 months as full members, asking questions that put the answers on record. 11 hours presenting a petition so thorough it used the Conclave's own history as a blade. And then, when the blade was refused, when the founding species chose punishment over reform, they walked out. They did not fire a shot. They did not issue an ultimatum. They did not build a rival alliance. They opened a door and left it open behind them, and half the galaxy walked through it. Seni Mal was no longer an archivist. She had resigned from the Conclave's records office 2 months after the walkout, packed her personal files into a case, and taken a transport to the Ilvari homeworld. 3 weeks later, she was on Earth. She worked now as a liaison between the Ilvari government and the Human Diplomatic Corps. Her job was translation, not of languages, which machines handled, but of intentions. The Ilvari thought in cycles. Humans thought in lines. Making them understand each other required someone who had spent 90 years inside the Conclave's architecture, and understood that every species communicated through the shape of what they did not say. Her main project was a document the humans had started calling the Mirror Protocols. It was the petition, restructured, not as an accusation, but as a template, a framework any species could use to audit its own treaties, its own trade agreements, its own internal structures, and ask the same question the humans had asked in the assembly hall. By what right? The question was contagious. Seni had watched it spread. The Ilvari used it to renegotiate their domestic colonial charters. The 10 used it to dissolve a trade monopoly their founding government had maintained for 3 centuries. The Kashuori used it to restructure their military hierarchy, which had been modeled on Conclave security protocols, and was, they discovered, designed to keep power concentrated in a single caste. The humans did not impose these changes. They did not demand them. They published the data, shared the analytical tools, and stepped back. What each species did with the mirror was their own choice. Sene thought about this often. She had spent 90 years in the archive, surrounded by records that contained every truth the Conclave had ever buried, and she had not seen them. Not because they were hidden, because she had not thought to look. She had accepted the system because the system was old and large and had always been there, and she had mistaken its permanence for its legitimacy. The humans had not made that mistake. They were too young for it. They had no institutional memory telling them this is how things are. They had only questions and patience and the terrifying willingness to act on the answers. On Earth, Kirith Selen stood at a window in the new diplomatic center, a building that had been a university library 6 months ago and still smelled like old paper and coffee. Marin Soy stood beside her. They were watching the preparations for the summit. Delegates from 14 species were arriving. Landing craft dotted the field outside like scattered seeds. What would have happened, Soy asked, if they had accepted the petition? Kirith looked at him. She walked to her desk and picked up the briefcase. The old one, the scratched one. She opened it. Inside was a document, bound, printed on physical paper like the petition. The counter-proposal. Soy had heard about it, but had never seen it. He read the first page. Fair terms. Reasonable modifications to the charter. A 50-year integration ramp that would gradually lift trade restrictions and military caps as humanity demonstrated institutional stability. Mutual oversight committees, shared economic development zones, a reformed induction process for future species. It would have worked. The conclave would have bent, not broken. The founding species would have kept their seats, their influence, their history, adjusted, reformed, but intact. The system would have survived. Soy stared at the document for a long time. They would have kept everything, he said. Kirith nodded. Everything. The power, the structure, the hierarchy. All of it would have continued, reformed at the edges, but unchanged at the core. The Droon would still be gone. The Vasquet would still be a blank line in the records. The charter would still exist, lighter in language, but identical in function. The reasonable path. She closed the briefcase. They chose the mirror, she said. We just held it up. Soy looked out the window at the landing craft, at the delegates emerging, at the representatives of 14 species who had traveled to a small blue planet, because a species they had never taken seriously had done something no one in the galaxy had ever done. Not conquered, not threatened, not negotiated from strength. Asked a question, out loud, on the record, and when the answer was silence, they did not raise their voices. They left the room. Voron stood at the viewport of Keth Vasur. The station still orbited its star. The assembly hall still existed. The lights were still on. The system still hummed. Everything was exactly as it had been for 11,000 years, except for the thing that mattered. Below him, a human cargo vessel completed its transit and jumped to faster than light. A small ship. Unremarkable. He watched the space where it had been. Empty now. Dark. Behind him, the assembly hall's lights illuminated 27 occupied seats out of a possible 42. The session schedule showed 3 cancellations this week. Hadron Voss had requested medical leave. The Rathan trade minister had been recalled to his homeworld. Paleth had stopped bringing his recording device. The lights stayed on. The hall stayed open. Nobody came. Voron had spent 600 years in this building. He had helped write the charters. He had voted for the restrictions. He had watched the Droon seat go empty and told himself it was natural. The way one tells oneself that a crack in the foundation is just the building settling. The hall stretched behind him, beautiful and vast, and engineered for the voices of 42 species. Half the seats were empty. The lights stayed on, because no one had thought to turn them off. Or perhaps because turning them off would mean admitting what the humans had made everyone see, that the light had been illuminating an empty room for a very long time. Voron sat down in his seat. He folded his 4 hands in his lap. He looked at the empty podium where Kirith Selen had stood, and asked a question that had no answer. By what right? He sat there for a long time,